Yeah, if you want me to start right off the bat, I can do that.
So,
no problem.
Does anybody have any other questions or anything that we could discuss before Erik gets started? No? Okay, well, here we go. I'm going to introduce Erik. He gave me his bio. Thank you. This is Erik Desotelle. Did I pronounce that right?
Yep, you did.
Desotelle, okay. He's a wholesale sales representative at Johnson's Nursery, and he really just likes to talk about plants. Well, we have something in common, Erik. He previously worked in the retail department at Johnson's Nursery, helping homeowners with their landscape selection. He's also an adjunct horticulture instructor at Gateway. When not at the nursery, you can find Erik hiking in one of the Wisconsin state parks, complaining about invasive species, or just talking to trees. That sounds like somebody that I would want to know. So welcome to our first virtual meeting. Thank you for your bravery. And I guess you know how to do this. So
yeah,
go ahead and share the screen, right?
Yeah, no problem. Well, thank you all for having me too. This is really exciting. And I even did like a new presentation for this one too. So I'm excited to roll this one out. Real quick in the chat, I'm going to throw a link here because I like to do my stuff a little bit more like participatory rather than just, talking at a screen for 4.5 hours. So it's too much doing that in class already this semester. So, but that's a link that's got a list of like native plants that we grow or have grown in the past. It's kind of a rough one, but it's more for use with discussion later on in this presentation. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute and shout them out right away or throw them right into the chat, because I would rather address it right off the bat than wait until the end and suddenly we've lost a chance to talk about a good subject in there. So let me just get this PowerPoint up. And hit that button.
Oh, by the way, Erik, I just wanted to mention that this presentation is being recorded on Zoom, and I do plan on saving it and maybe showing it. Like, we had some thoughts that maybe we'd have like a YouTube channel or something in the future. So I just wanted everyone to be aware that this is being recorded, and hopefully that's okay.
All right, sounds good. All right, so this is my presentation on natives and urban sites. So got a nice photo of the Old World Beer Hall down here in downtown Milwaukee, and some scragglier looking plants because they're in, such a restricted planting area. So the real question is, why natives, right? And we've already talked about, the benefits of urban greening. Thankfully, people have gotten to learn this over time, or at least these statistics have become tired for me. But, trees and native shrubs and native perennial prairie plants and whatnot, they intercept stormwaters, they improve property values. I think that having a large tree in your yard was supposed to do like between 3 and 5% increase in your property value, and having a finished landscape can add anywhere from 10 to 15% to your property value. So that's already been established. I think it was a Canadian study 5 years ago, but it was actually backed up with research. It's not just me pulling a number out of nowhere. People like to say that, trees reduce crime. People who have hospital rooms that are near, like an outdoor window tend to have better health outcomes. And, you can look at that and say trees are great, but also you could say, oh, so cities that have money to put into their urban forestry departments also tend to have money to like invest in their communities, but I'm not going to get into that. But these are all great reasons to have plants in urban areas, right? These are all good things that we can agree are, I don't think anyone would say like, no, I want to have less stormwater interception. I want more runoff. But the benefit of native plants in urban areas is that they're actually active participants in that surrounding ecosystem. They're not just there to soak up water and purify the air and look pretty. They also provide benefits to things other than humans, other than urban areas, in terms of food and habitat for wildlife. So, however, there are problems with plants in urban areas, and especially native plants. We have a lot of conflicts that exist out there. We've got salt spray, as you can see here with those evergreens here. We've got restricted rooting zones. We've got, construction and whatnot that impedes plant growth overall. And people like to say, oh yeah, native plants, like they're not going to have the resiliency of climate change. They're not going to have the drought tolerance that we need to have in the next 20, 30 years when, Lake Michigan dries up and we're all just, wearing bandanas all the time because everything is sand all over the place. But you know, I feel like a lot of these arguments are kind of tired and like overused, you know, like, oh yeah, like native plants aren't adapted to urban areas, you know, like we don't have as many options for shapes with them, which, you know, that one I'll give a little bit of credence to. But everyone says, oh, plants didn't grow up in concrete. And I'm like, yeah, well, none of these European cultivars that we use did either. But, you know, we still plant them in urban areas because somehow they're better. Really, I think that it's beyond just a plant issue here. I don't think that it's actually the plant's fault. You know, let's take like for an example, you know, we've got a shepherd here who complains that his greyhound is a bad sheepdog. Or we've got a carpenter who is frustrated that their hammer won't drive screws. Is this the fault of the hammer or the greyhound, or is this something else? You know, is like who's to blame for this breakdown in communication here? Because you could say it's the carpenter or the shepherd's fault because they should know better, but frankly, I don't think it's anybody's fault. It could just be ignorance on the part of the practitioner. And that's where I'm getting at with this, is that the real issue of using native plants in an urban setting is not necessarily one of plant reliability and performance, but instead of properly assessing an urban site and putting the right plant in that location that's going to be set up for success. So let's take an example here. We've got Eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana. Tough as nails plant. They grow on like roadsides. There's one that's growing. It came up from seed. It's in the ramp from 94 heading eastbound, going north onto 175 by Miller Park. And there's this scraggly little plant that like year after year keeps getting its top knocked off by snowplows and keeps having half of it like scorched off from salt in the winter. But every year that thing puts on like 6 inches, you know, so it's going to get bigger at some point, or until, you know, the DOT decides to spray it with some herbicide. But, you know, fingers crossed that doesn't happen for too long. They take salt really well. They're super deer resistant and rabbit resistant. Like in really harsh winters, you'll see some rabbit browsing on them, but it's not a common thing. And they're super drought tolerant. But if you take this plant and you put it in like a shaded wet site and you want to have it be there for screening, it's going to die. Or at least it's going to be so thin that you're going to wonder if it was ever supposed to be a screening plant in the first place. And why is that? Meanwhile, if you take a paper birch, which everyone thinks is a terrible plant in urban areas, that, oh, it gets bronze birch borer, it dies all the time, it's not a hardy, tough plant. But if you put that in the same kind of environment where it's got a nice shaded root zone, frequently available moisture, nice full sun up on the top of the foliage, it's going to outlive any other birch in an urban area, especially river birch, which everyone thinks is the super tough urban birch because they're resistant to bronze birch borer and they tolerate wet soils and yada, yada, yada. But paper birch is actually the better adapted one because it tolerates alkaline soil, and river birch does not do that. It gets chlorotic. It tends to die out after like 20, 30 years. So how does a paper birch survive while a eastern red cedar fails? Given that both of these plants have like wildly different experiences in terms of like what's a good plant to put in an urban area and what's not. And really the issue is, again, that idea of site assessment and site selection, you know, looking at what you have to work with and what is going to be compatible with that location moving forward. Now, the best way to figure out plants is to start off with your site assessment, but really that's the site-centric method. You know, you go out, you assess your site, you determine what your goals are for planting. You know, do I want to have screening? Do I need to have stormwater interception? Am I trying to provide habitat? And these can be goals for the site, goals for the landowner, goals for people that use that area. Any one of those things are all those goals that fit into this broad umbrella here. But you want to look at what your objectives are for that location and then figure out what plants meet those objectives while also being compatible with the site. And then you kind of go through that cyclical process of reevaluating your goals and selections of like, okay, like what here is going to be compatible? Okay, we've kind of narrowed it down a little bit. What can we do from here on out, like to figure out which of these plants is going to be best suited? Because we narrowed it down from 10 to 5 or from 5 to 3. But frankly, the human-centric option is the one that I've used more often because a lot of people would come into the nursery wanting to plant a tree or wanting to plant a shrub. I like 9-bark. I want to have a maple. I would like to have a nice shade tree. They already have this notion of what they want to have in this location, and that's totally fine, right? So people come in with their idea of plants, and then we assess their site and view if that plant is compatible with it. And if so, great. But if not, then we can start doing that cyclical process of, figuring out what plant would be compatible for that location based on their goals for that plant. So again, it's not a huge difference, but I think it's important to call out because like this is the like academic best way to be doing it, but this is the real way that it happens. And I don't care like how perfect of a method you have for this option. If you don't have people that are excited about planting plants, they're not going to be planting them or spending the money on planting them. So I know jumping right in here with picking out your plant, but people have what they want to do. So someone might have a very good attachment to like bur oak as like, oh yeah, like my great grandpa had a huge one on the farm when we were growing up. And, it was just so cool to always hang out and climb in that tree as a kid. Or, I want a maple because, I got married in fall and I like that red fall color was everywhere. And that's a really sentimental, important tree to me. Or, I want crab apples because they're pretty and they flower and they smell nice. Like, it doesn't have to be some like long lost or super well thought out reason to like something. You're allowed to just like things because you think they're pretty. But people pick things because they want them. Then we want to look at what our goals are for that location. And sometimes these don't match up. I would have customers come in that wanted a crab apple, but then they also like didn't really want to have insects in their yard, which, if you're going to have flowers, you're going to have bees and pollinators out there. And if you're going to have fruits, you're going to have wasps coming and feeding on that. So you have to look at like, okay, so what was this initial selection that we had? And now does it actually line up with what these rankings are here? So if you prioritize flowering and fragrance and then providing habitat for pollinators and birds, and then, shade and screening would be nice, but they're not essential. There's a lot of good options for that. You could go with like a prairie crab apple, because even though that one tends to get like pretty defoliated by the end of the season because it just gets nailed with fungal problems, it does an excellent job of providing, like habitat and food resources to insects and birds. Whereas if you really want a screening plant and you don't really care about the fragrant or flowering aspect, but you still want to support birds, at that point you might look at doing like a thornless cockspur hawthorn, because those are really dense plants, really thick and foliated ones that provide a great job of screening, but like they're not particularly fragrant flowers. And if that's not important to you, that's fine. But both of these are very different plants from each other. It's not like, choose your own adventure. Oh, what do you know? We all end up with the same ending here. Like it diverges wildly based on what your perceptions and goals of that site are moving forward. So once you've like looked at that plant and figured out like what your goals are for that location, then you want to start looking at your site. So what size plant will your site accommodate? Are we looking at something that's going to be a small stature tree, less than 25 feet tall and wide, medium stature in that like 25 to 40 foot range, or large stature 50 plus? And I know that like American elms and bur oaks tend to get, 80, 90, 100 feet tall. And that's great on like a botanical time scale of like, a plant living for like 150, 200, 300 years. But we have to be real here that the average lifespan of urban plants is going to be significantly shortened. So that's why I use those like, more tamed sizes, because I don't want to go off of like what the plant can grow to be in the woods. I want to go off of what you typically see in the urban landscape after 30 years of planting. So you want to look at the spread of the plant, you want to look at the mature height that it'll get, and you want to consider the form too. So if you are planting near a walkway, you want something that has a canopy that can be raised up, to 6 or 8 or however many feet you want it to be to give clearance over that space, versus something that might branch out much lower and be much wider that you can't really limb up because you don't have that freedom with the mature height of that plant. You want to look at how much sunlight you get. And you also want to consider how much reflected light you get in urban areas. You might have a tree that's in a location that seems like it's never going to get sunlight. And while it might never get direct light, if it's surrounded by white or glass buildings, a lot of that light is going to be reflected back onto it. And that plant is going to be subject to more sunlight than you would think is the case. You also want to consider moisture and whether or not that's consistent, because it can vary wildly in urban soils. One of my instructors in college, Dr. Brian Sharonbrock, had a great mnemonic for it, that urban soils are a harsh dirt. And that stood for anthropogenic, heterogeneous, alkaline, inert, reduced, tainted. I'm going totally out of order here because there were a lot of like phrases that went into that. But really, urban soils are just a mess. It's probably the easiest way to sum it up because it is all over the place in terms of texture, in terms of composition, and like organic matter content. And that all impacts how much moisture is able to be held in that location. Sometimes you'll have a site where you've got, a good 3 feet of soil, and you think, oh yeah, this is like really nice, good soil. We should have really good drainage here. But maybe at 3.5 feet, there's actually a buried roadway that's totally impermeable. So now this plant is sitting in a tub there functionally. So you have to look at like how that site performs under various conditions and look at what happens when it gets wet. If it gets wet, does it drain quickly? Does it not drain quickly? If it drains quickly, does it actually drain through all the way, or does it just drain to a depth that you just can't see it? When you dig a hole there, the top might look rather dry, but you dig down 2 feet and suddenly it's starting to pond, you might have some moisture issues there. Do you have any hostile agents to contend with? And I mean, that's like just in general, like deer, rabbits, animals that or wildlife that will damage the plant. It includes people. Do you have an urban site with commercial maintenance happening out there where, usually you have a lot of hired summer help out there that don't really know how to not weed whack the stem of a tree when they're cleaning out the weeds around it, or how to mulch a plant properly. You're going to have things acting against this tree in that location. So you want to make sure that you identify what those agents are going to be and how you can protect the tree from that. And then, of course, we want to look at the conflicts that exist in that space. So what utilities are we dealing with above and below ground? I've seen plenty of trees that have had their tops continuously chopped off and, now they're just a big bush because they're stuck right below a power line. And conversely, I've seen beautiful big trees that end up having to get removed because they had the ill fortune of growing over a natural gas or a water line, or even worse, they grew into somebody's old like early 1900s like porcelain, or what is it, like terracotta or whatever, like the old school drain tile for your pipes. And suddenly the tree grew into there and it's like, oh, I can't have the tree here anymore because it's wrecking my pipes. And it's like, no, it's just seeking out moisture. Just get roto-rooter out there every 5 years. It's not a big deal, but I digress. What kind of like traffic do you have? That's vehicle traffic and that's also pedestrian traffic. Do you have a lot of like foot traffic around this plant? Because people compact soil too. And how is this plant going to fit into that overall like traffic pattern out there? You don't want to plant a tree right in the middle of where a sidewalk's supposed to be going because we're trying to have people walk through that location. You don't want to impede the flow of traffic. Otherwise, you might put a sidewalk that curves around it, but people are going to cut straight across that and walk right across that rooting zone. So how can we make sure that the tree's not in the way of things in that location? And lastly, that land use, what is that space being used for? So that's going to impact like what kinds of pressures you're going to have on that plant in that location. And then of course, after we've assessed our site and we have figured out what our goals are, we can narrow it down to a couple of plants, and now we can reevaluate the goals. So what do we want? And then rank what we want to have again. It could be the same. We could narrow it down further, or we might realize, you know what? I really wanted an evergreen for that space, but I wanted to screen my patio, and I'm not in my patio in November. I'm not using that space. I don't need to have it screened. So maybe a deciduous plant is a better option. And now you can widen out your selections again. That's actually one that would come up a lot, was the idea of, I need 8-foot tall evergreens all around my property on my berm, and I don't want to see my neighbor ever, and I don't even want to like acknowledge that there's other humans within 100 miles of me, and I don't want to spend more than $200. It's like, well, you can't have that. But if people were more budget conscious, deciduous plants were a great option for that, because a suckering multi-stemmed shrub that gets to be 8 feet tall is an excellent option because they'll get up to that size. And if you want to make them smaller, great, prune them. They're multi-stem. They're going to rejuvenate from the base. Can't really do that with an arborvitae and just keep the top constantly lopped off. Plus, there's deer too. So again, we want to have this cyclical process that we're going through in terms of how we evaluate what kind of plants are accessible or suitable for a particular site. So I'm going to go into like 4 different site locations of like urban sites that I think are particularly challenging. And this is where I'm looking to get a little more participation here. So we're going to talk about these 4 sites, what kinds of conflicts exist in those areas, and then how we can select plants that like meet those goals out there. Real quick, let me just stop sharing for a second here. I want to make sure I've got the right order set up on these slides. Just playing around with it earlier. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we've got your typical terrace and median planting. Terrace being that, like, 3 to 4 foot to, if you're lucky, like a 6 foot space between the sidewalk and the roadway or the curb. Medians being, stuff that's either in like the middle of the street, or I like to think of some of these like little bump outs in like more parking or like shopping area locations as being more of that like median type planting. But in these locations, we have salt to contend with. Obviously, it's a high traffic location for both vehicles and people. So there's going to be salt in winter. There's no way around that. We want to look at canopy height as a big like thing to consider here. So when I was with the city of Milwaukee as a tree climber there, we had to keep all of our street trees limbed up to 13 feet because that is the clearance set for roadways that we had to maintain so that they weren't like impeding the flow of traffic. Does anybody know why it's like 13 feet, or actually I think it's like 12 feet 6 inches, but does anyone know where that standard came from?
Does it have something to do with trucks?
It does, but what kind of trucks?
I don't know, like your basic box truck?
Kind of. It actually came from like the 1950s when like they built the interstate system. So that was actually all designed so that we could land our bombers in the middle of nowhere because we wanted to have big interstates that we could use for military staging. And that clearance over the roadways was so that we could drive tanks and trucks down the streets so that we could mobilize troops through urban areas. Because it was the 50s, it was the height of the Cold War. We wanted to make sure that if the Russians came here, we could do something about that. I always thought that was an interesting like start of that standard. I thought it was just like, oh yeah, semi trucks are that height too, but that standard actually comes from, being able to drive military vehicles down the street. So fun fact. But with that 13-foot canopy height, we also have to consider vehicle damage. When I was growing up and in Milwaukee, there was a hackberry that was further down the street from us, maybe like 2 blocks, that like had one larger limb that came out probably at like 8 feet up on the tree, and it kind of went out a little bit over the road. But it was such a large branch that, to remove that, you'd have to make a pretty large pruning cut. So it kind of like stayed on there. But every like 3 years, you always had like a nice square chunk just shaved out of it because a truck would be driving on the street and plow into that branch. So we want to make sure that we've got something that can be easily pruned and maintained to reach a height that's not going to impede traffic. Of course, we're going to have soil compaction, and we are going to have alkaline soil because urban sites have concrete, and concrete over time breaks down into calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate increases the pH of sites over time, making them more alkaline. Generally speaking, alkaline soils tend to have less nutrients available compared to soils that are like either neutral or like, 6.5 to 7. I think 6.8 is kind of that sweet spot where all of those 14 macronutrients that plants need are all, micro and macronutrients are all available to plants in those locations. In these areas too, they're generally dry because you don't really have urban irrigation systems set up. So that tree's kind of going to be getting whatever water it gets. Same goes for any shrubs in these locations too. And you're going to have a restricted rooting zone. So while this tree might be rooting under all this, pavement out here, I don't know if that's actually permeable or if they do have like a weed barrier or fabric underneath that's reducing the amount of water going into that location. So now we're on to another site, the corporate plaza. So for these locations, they share some of those conditions with the median planting. We've got lots of salt, and especially so because this is a corporate location, it's open year round. So people are going to be entering and exiting these buildings and using these walkways. This is the Aerotech office park up like on 41. And they have this nice planting of boxwoods here that I think they put in like 4 or 5 years ago. And it has steadily gotten worse and worse because those things keep getting burned and burned by the amount of salt that they put down on these sidewalks. And it is a ludicrous amount of salt. Like I was surprised at how much was going down. But that's something to be considering in these locations. Again, we've got that restricted rooting zone. We've also got this like push towards like a lower mess because Now we're in like this corporate setting. We want to make sure that it's like tidy and neat and clean. Of course, urban trees want to be a low mess too, but like if you're planting Norway maples, don't even talk to me about mess because you clearly don't care about it, but I digress. Um, in these areas, you're going to have alkaline soil too, because, again, we've got a lot of pavement, but you might not. You might not actually have a lot of concrete in these areas. You might have a different material that's being used to build walkways. The same goes for moisture too, where in these kinds of settings, you can have more of an irrigation system installed that can be monitoring and maintaining the moisture of the plants in these sites. So there's a little bit of a higher investment of care in these locations. But you do have a lot of pedestrian traffic out here. So again, while like at a street tree, you got the sidewalk there and you got the roadway that, maybe people are walking down every now and again. In these sites, there's a much heavier pressure of foot traffic. So we have to think about how our plantings are interacting with the movement of people through here. So if I have to go from here to the building that I cropped out of this picture here, from here, what am I going to do? Am I going to walk on the street down that way, or am I going to cut right through over here? And so are you going to try to impede my path by putting shrubs there to encourage me not to go that way? Or are you going to make sure that you've got like a walkway built in and plants that can tolerate like foot compaction through this location, because people are going to be traveling that route? Then we've got playgrounds. So these are a fun one. You don't really have as much salt on playgrounds because generally they get shut down in the winter. Like kids are either playing outside, like on the parking lot area of the playground, which is usually plowed, not so much salted. Or like, it's just not really, salt isn't really an issue on playground sites. I don't really see it being used that much. You do have compaction, lots of kids out there. Alkaline soils could be a potential issue. They might not be though, because parks generally like have been green spaces for a while, or at least like, they usually have some soil amendments done to them. So alkaline soils is kind of up in the air on that. You do have to contend with vandalism though, because kids like to climb on things, and it's hard to tell it like a 5 or an 8-year-old, like, hey, you can't climb that 2-inch tree. That's not strong enough to hold you up. Oh, now you fell and you're crying and you ripped out half of the branching on that plant. So, you have to contend with what is compatible with the use for that area, because kids are going to climb trees. You can't stop them. And frankly, I don't think you want to. You just have to make sure that the plant is going to work with that. And of course, safety. So again, back to this idea of we want durable trees in these locations. We want durable shrubs. But if you're planting a tree out here, you want to pick something that is going to have sturdier wood. You don't want to plant like a willow that is going to be prone to dropping a lot of branches out there. You don't want to be planting a particularly thorny shrub like barberry, again, not native, but a great example of something that kind of sucks to deal with in general. You don't want to be putting barberry out there that kids are going to get scraped up in because they, run a little bit outside of the play area. And you don't want to plant things that have potentially toxic like fruits to them, Not saying that like you can't have anything that produces alkaloids in it, but at the same time, kids are dumb and they're going to put whatever they can in their mouths. So if you've got like buckeye or like a Kentucky coffee tree, like those seeds that they produce can be kind of toxic. So making sure that either there's some signage up saying don't eat these, or, that there's some education going on to like, throw them at your friends, go ahead, but don't eat them. That's all important stuff. And then lastly, we've got the compact urban lot that, is really frequently found in like Milwaukee's like north side-ish, it's where I grew up, but a lot of the backyards tended to be, maybe 20 by 20 feet. You've got a garage, you've got maybe like a patio or a walkway, but I would say that no more than like 3/4 of that space tends to actually be green. It tends to be pretty restricted. So in these sites, you've got a really high utility density. You've got lots of pipes underground. You've got lots of cables in the air. You've got your power lines, but you've also got your telephone and your cable lines that are coming to the houses. And those come in much lower because cable gets to do whatever they want. They don't actually have to pay attention to like, good heights above plant material and so on. You've got a really high use of that land. That's a high traffic and frankly, a high impact area because that's your backyard. If I'm going to go read a book in summer, I'm going to go do it in my backyard. So there's a higher stake involved in that location because it's your space. You want it to be a nice space for you. 'Cause there's a greater level of agency with what gets planted in those locations. In these backyards, you also have wildly variable moisture and soil texture because there's buried downspouts. You don't know where your neighbor's roof is pitched to. There could be a slight grade that drains all the way to your back of your yard, and while your yard might have a lot of vegetation in it, your garage roof doesn't. And if all of the water on that is coming and leaking out into that one corner, that's going to be a really wet spot. Same thing goes for soil texture. People rip things up and change things in the yard all the time. I think growing up, our backyard changed at like once, twice, 3 times. I think we had turf 3 times. Once it was all wood chips. And once it was, yeah, I think it was wood chips the 2 times in between. And then there was a patio and the patio got moved. But basically the soil is a huge mess out there. There's like gravel and sand in some locations and it's like crappy clay in other spots. And then suddenly, oh, we wanted to empty out the garden this year. So this area has super rich, wonderful, well built up soil. So that can all happen within the span of 5 feet from one another. So the soil can be all over the place. You can't really rely on like just one test in that location. You kind of have to go through and do a couple of different little digging spots to really see what you have to deal with out there. So when it comes to selecting plants, and again, there's that link in the chat that I put, that's for a list of, native plants that we can look at. So I would encourage all of you to like pull that up and like throw it on the side of your screen, because I want to like reference that as we go through here. But there's 2 different approaches we can take towards selecting plant material. So one is through elimination. And I think that elimination is a much better option than picking out like the best plant, because when you start thinking about the best plant, you start to get lazy in your decision making. You start to default to, what's a tough plant, what's drought tolerant, what's really easy to put out here. And I actually fell into that trap making this presentation, because I was trying to make a list of, okay, let's do lists of plants that are good for different locations. And suddenly I realized like, oh, I'm defaulting to all these, Kentucky coffee tree, honey locust, thornless cockspur hawthorn. Like all of these are good plants, don't get me wrong, but that's a pretty narrow view of plants that are good for urban areas. So instead of looking at what's a good plant, we should start focusing on what we should eliminate from our plant palette based on the conditions of that site. So if we've got an area that has wet soils, then we eliminate all plants that we know can't tolerate wet feet. If it has dry soils, then we eliminate all of our plants that can't tolerate drought conditions. So cross out pagoda dogwood, cross out like red osier dogwood to some extent. Silver maple's kind of in the middle there. It can grow in drier space, but it likes to have wet feet. Willows aren't going to tolerate drought that well. But through that process of elimination, we're starting with a wide group of plants and then narrowing down, rather than just starting off with this little bubble of, here's the plants that I'm comfortable working with because I know these are tough. Like I said, it's easy to fall into that trap of here's 3 shrubs and here's 3 trees that I like, and they perform well reliably in a lot of different sites. So why would I recommend anything else? And yeah, it's easy that way, but you're also missing out on a lot of inherent like opportunities to try out some different things. So we want to make sure that we're like giving every plant a fair shot at going into a location, because pagoda dogwood, again, is a really sensitive plant. Shallow root system, needs to have like consistent moisture, can't tolerate drought. But if you have a space that's like always soggy and wet and is kind of protected in the afternoon, it's an excellent choice for that spot. So we don't want to just cross out plants because we think that they're more sensitive. It's just making sure that we're looking at the site conditions and saying, okay, what is not going to work out here and what does that leave us with as options? The other way that we can approach this is looking at what would be the go-to in that location in terms of any ornamental plant. So we could say, what tree would you put out here? Like, I want fall colors. Like, oh yeah, maple, so easy to jump at that one and think this is a good plant for that location. But what we want to do beyond that is then consider that plant and why we picked that. What makes maple a good tree? Well, it's got reliable, consistent fall color. So that's one characteristic that we can inform like our initial goals. It's got, like a larger stature to it. So again, like another goal, like large stature, shade tree, consistent fall color. And then going from there in terms of like, okay, what else fits these niches in these locations? So this is the other route that you can take when it comes to selecting those plants. So if we go back to these sites, the terrace and the median planting, what's our appropriate go-to? What is our like plant that you can jump to or that you see all the time in urban areas for like a street tree or a median planting? And there will be a test at the end of this too. No, I'm kidding. I mean, Norway maple is a really common one in Milwaukee because we had a lot of creativity in like the 70s. After, Dutch elm disease wiped out everything, we thought, dang it, we lost all these elm trees. Can't do that again. So rather than like planting another monoculture of elms, we're going to plant a monoculture of maples instead. And we didn't really think that went through too much. Thankfully, we've kind of learned our lesson with the ash trees now, but 40% of Milwaukee's canopy is maples, 20% is ash trees, so that's already 60% of our urban forest cover. So elms, maples, ashes are pretty common urban trees, pretty easy ones to propagate. They're generally less expensive too. So those would be like our 3 plants that are like our go-to. So like what makes those plants like good for urban areas? What are we looking for in those plants that's suitable?
Grow fast.
Yeah, fast growth. They give us that immediate impact. They're not going to just sit there for a decade and kind of like, put on maybe 3 inches a year if they feel like it. So yeah, good performance, predictable growth habits. Great. What else do we have in those plants that's like a good characteristic that we're trying to seek out by planting those plants?
Are they disease resistant?
So we got disease resistance. Yep. So fairly disease free, at least no like, plant ending diseases until you get a new invasive pest that wipes them out. And then there was another one that I heard.
No, I was just curious. Is this question regarding any urban area? You showed us 4
No, specifically for the tree, the median plantings,
like the median
terrace planting is a median planting. So with the idea that, we've got these things to deal with in this location, like what is our like go-to for those?
Well, it can't require much of a root system then, right?
Yeah, so like not a lot of surface roots to it. That's excellent. And something that has a large canopy too, great. So we want something that's going to kind of grow out, fill out this space, doesn't have a super aggressive root system, tends to like root down rather than like root out and wide like a silver maple. And don't get me started on rooting habits of trees because I hear that all the time from people like, oh, I don't want a tree that busts up my patio. And it's like, it's not the tree's fault, that's your soil's fault, but I'm not going to get into that. Anyways, so good rooting habit, tends to have like a deeper root system to it, tolerates that crappier soil, nice rounded or large canopy to give us that like, shade benefit and faster growing. So with that in mind, with like the maples and the elms and the ashes, well, not really ash anymore, like what else fits that like role for an urban tree? What's similar to a maple or similar to an elm tree that's native?
How about a hackberry?
Hackberry would be a great one. Hackberry is a nice bottomland species that, tolerates drought just as well. It's got a cool bark on it. I don't think it has any like major disease problems aside from like some witches brooming and occasionally like nipple gall on the foliage, but both of those tend to be really cosmetic in nature. They're not really like, harmful to the long-term longevity of the plant. So that would be a great option. Maybe shagbark hickory. That has a nice long, deep taproot. That is a good drought tolerant species. Big leaves to it, provides really good shade. And like pretty rapid growth rate once you've established it. Shagbark hickories will take like a long time to get going from seed, but by the time you've got it as like an 1 3/4, 2 inch caliper plant, they're putting on a good 18, 24 inches per year of growth. So that's definitely an option for an urban area. Any other ideas?
What about like a sumac or one of those leaves that are kind of feathery?
Yeah, something with kind of a dissected leaf almost. So you could look at, black walnut is a great one. So that one's allelopathic and, it can like poison the ground around it against some plants. The biggest one is nightshade. So like don't try to grow tomatoes underneath it. But if you're growing tomatoes in your terrace, in your urban site, you already have other problems. But that does have like a really rapid growth rate, tolerates alkaline soil super well. Tolerates drought, tolerates wet. Yeah, sure, bigger fruits, and so does the shagbark hickory. But then again, people also plant Norway maples that produce a bajillion helicopters per year. So whenever people are like, "Oh, it's too messy," I kind of think like, well, there's not really anything that's like not messy at all. So you're always gonna have that to contend with. Kentucky coffee tree would have another like compound leaf like that too. So that would be another good option. Trying to think of what else has that kind of leaf shape to it. Honey locust would also provide that. Honey locust is like kind of native, kind of not. Like it's a little bit more southern than us. I think it still has some populations in Wisconsin, but I'm not 100% sure. But you know, it's a really close neighbor. So I don't know, I kind of lump it in with like good trees for urban areas because it still produces food and habitat for insects and wildlife that live in our region here. So ginkgo is kind of a neat one too, because that one is like historically, I think ginkgo was found in like our region, like way, way, way in the past. Same goes for like dawn redwood. Might have been a different species, but at least in the same genus. So if it was native, you know, hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago, is it still counting as native? I don't know. That's a neat option to look at though. So, but we've got these different trees that we've picked out as like, you know, what could be a good alternative opposed to like what we gravitate to as an urban planting. The other thing we can look at is say, you know, looking at these characteristics, and again, going to that PDF of native plants that I put in the chat there, what would be inappropriate? What can we cross right off the bat for urban trees that are like good for that medium
Willows.
planting? Yes, willow is going to be very inappropriate for that location because they're messy as all get out. They're too big and they have really aggressive root systems. So we know we can't use that one. So cross off anything in the Salix genus. How about the family of it? You know, the Salicaceae family. What else is in there? We've got Salix. We've also got Populus. So quaking aspen, big tooth aspen, cottonwood. Are those appropriate urban trees?
Not the cottonwood.
Yeah, I mean, they're all well, cottonwood just gets big, and then quaking and big tooth aspen are colony forming, which isn't really a good like thing that we want to have in an urban tree for that terrace planting. So cross out that whole like family, and we've narrowed down our plant list even further. What else would be like a bad choice for those locations?
You wouldn't put any birch in there, would you?
Not in that terrace planting location. That's a great one too. So like birch probably wouldn't work well. There's not enough rooting area. There's not like cool enough soil. And if you did river birch, well, they need alkali or acidic soil, which you're not really going to get in those terraces. So cross those out. And what else is in the Betulaceae family? We've got ironwood and musclewood. Ironwood is drought tolerant, shade tolerant, medium, small stature tree. It's a nice plant, but it's kind of conditional. Which again, this is that going back to that idea of like eliminating things based on our specific site characteristics, because ironwood does not tolerate soil salt well at all. Like it can't handle it. But some of the most beautiful, largest ironwoods I've seen have been street trees up in Green Bay. And that's because they're on side streets. They're on, you know, like 14th Street and like whatever like weird cross street name you want to give to it. It's not like a main thoroughfare. Can you plant it in the middle of a median on like a 4-lane? Absolutely not. But as someone's like front yard tree when they're on like a little cul-de-sac, absolutely, there's not nearly as much salt in that location. Same thing goes for musclewood too. I've seen plenty of dead musclewoods as street trees, but that's because they're in the wrong spot. It's not because the tree's fault. It's because someone said, oh, we're on a slope here where it's pretty dry. Let's put a bottomland native species that likes to have wet soil right here, because that's not going to backfire at all. So it's just that idea.
I'm sorry. I just have to interrupt and tell you that I did that actual thing. I had a musclewood that I thought was cool, and I stuck it in like the same area that you just described, and it didn't survive. So just what you're saying is true. So I just thought that was funny.
Well, and I mean, it happens. I plant stuff and it dies too. I tried to grow astilbes at my parents' house 3 years in a row. And then I was like, you know what? I'm done dumping money into this. I'm going to go with a different plant because I really like the look of astilbes. I thought it would be a gorgeous shade plant, but the soil is way too dang dry, way too depleted for a plant that loves like organically rich, like consistently moist, but not too dry, not too wet. I mean, basically a Goldilocks plant is not going to do well in that location. So I had to give up on that one. So it's like either I can truck in, you know, like a yard of compost for like 2 perennials and like hope that it lasts for 3 years, or I can just go with something else that's actually going to thrive in this location. So Yeah, like we can eliminate pretty large quantities of plants based on our site characteristics because taxonomically they tend to share similar traits. You know, things in the birch family, I don't think there's anything in the Betulaceae family that has like a really deep taproot forming habit. You know, I don't think that there's anything there that's like super drought tolerant. Maybe river birch to some extent, but again, river birch doesn't tolerate that alkaline soil well. Um, so looking at narrowing down that list to like what's going to be suitable, you know, so now we've got maples. Let's look at those ones. So for native maples, we've got striped maple, mountain maple. Both are kind of small stature trees. Both are like more sensitive, like shade understory plants in Wisconsin. So given their native site, I'm going to lump them into the no-go location. But sugar maple, if it's not too salty or too sunny, can be great. If it is too salty and too sunny, you're going to have frost cracks for days on that thing. Like it's just, you know, it's kind of looking at that threshold level of what that plant can tolerate out there. So any questions on like the street trees location before we move on to the next section?
What about pines or cedars, things like that, arborvitae?
So as far as evergreens go, I think that arborvitae, Thuya occidentalis, has like the best like level of adaptability and toughness of all of our native species for evergreens. I mean, that tree grows in acidic bogs. It also grows on alkaline limestone outcroppings. If you've ever been up to Cave Point in Green or Indoor County, like you'll see exactly what I mean with trees that are literally growing out of the limestone bluffs over Lake Michigan. And it's like the only water they're getting is like rainfall, and they're in super alkaline substrate there. So clearly they have a wide range of site adaptability. Their only issue is that they like get browsed to high hell by deer. So you kind of have to temper that with what's suitable in those locations. So that would be an excellent plant. The only thing with those is I would put them on a street that has a speed limit of like 30 or less, because then you're going to have much lower salt spray on it. Faster than that, and you start to get salt spray really far away from the road. As an aside to that, the Morton Arboretum did a study, and they've got this huge berm right next to 294 that I think goes up like 100 feet. And it's also like, you know, like I want to say like at least half a football field, if not, you know, a full football field from 294 to like the interior of the Arboretum. And they put up like, or they set up test locations to see how far salt spray was traveling from 294 into the Arboretum. And it was going like over that entire berm, like
Wow.
up and over this like huge embankment. That was not enough to keep salt from like tainting the opposite side of that slope. So salt spray can travel very far. That's probably your biggest limiting factor for any evergreen. Exceptions to that being bald cypress, dawn redwood, and tamarack, because, well, they're conifers, but they're not actually evergreen. They don't have foliage in the winter, so there's nothing really for them to get burned with. So those evergreens can work as like median plantings. The issue is that they can't be in areas with a high amount of salt. Like that's just not going to work for them. So on a side street that, you know, is totally residential, yield signs, traffic calming all over the place, you know, speed limits like 25 miles an hour, you could try it out. Anything like more used than that, I wouldn't risk it. So, but yeah, great question. Any other ones on this section?
Nope.
All right. So we'll move on to like this idea of the corporate plaza. So again, we've got salt, restricted rooting zone, low mess, compaction, moisture, alkaline soil, pedestrian traffic. One that I forgot to put on here is not necessarily a conflict, but something that we seek out in these locations is something of ornamental value. I mean, we're talking about the entrances to multi-million-dollar offices. So clearly you don't want to have some scraggly junk plant out there, like looking like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree as people like walk into your swanky office. So like, what are we looking at as our appropriate go-to in these locations? And this is where I'm widening it out to, you know, all plants, like not just trees, but we also have to have shrubs and ground covers and ornamental like trees and shrubs, conifers and so on. So like, what do we think of when we think of like an office park, you know, like really showy plants for those locations?
Wait a minute. Let's see.
I think sometimes trees that provide shade that people might go out in the summer at lunchtime.
Yeah, so we want to have those like larger shade trees for locations where, you know, we've got that pedestrian use where people are being outside where they need some shelter. Totally, totally. So we want to have some larger plants out there. What else would, like, specific species wise, would work in those kinds of locations? Like, would we like
Flowering
what do you
crab.
usually see? Yeah, flowering crabapple, great one, excellent. So
Mountain
that's a
ash.
big one. Mountain ash, I don't see it for long though. I see it planted, I don't see it surviving. So like that's a mistake that people make, and like they bear the consequences of pretty quickly. I would say that one's not so much a candidate in corporate areas, because anyone that does plant it is going to find out really quickly that it's not really appropriate for those spots.
Oh.
Um,
Okay.
Eric, I'm seeing
Yeah.
a lot of what I think is a lilac tree.
My wife.
mm-hmm. Yeah, so
And I don't know
Japanese tree
about
lilac.
that.
Off my earphones. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, because they've got that nice like dense canopy, that smaller overall stature, kind of an interesting bark on them too, and they flower in like the middle of summer. So that's a good one. Not really so much fall color on it, but you know, it does its job out there. At that Aerotech office park, that's this photo here, they've got lots of flowering crabs here. They've got boxwood, they've got Korean lilac shrubs here. There's 2 honey locusts in the entrance. And then this area is crab apples, but underneath them is Bronx forsythia, which is a really like slow growing, shorter stature, flat topped forsythia that like doesn't really bloom for crab, but it does have a pretty purple fall color on it. So looking at those as our plant palette for this location, what would we swap out for that? Like what natives will fill those same roles? So let's start with that forsythia. Low growing, good fall color, flowering, like clearly was intended, but like never actually happened. So you can't really say that flowering is the reason we plant.
The native honeysuckle will be low and beautiful yellow flowers.
Yeah, the dwarf bush honeysuckle. That's an awesome plant for that location. Nice suckering, mounding shrub. Mow it down every 3 years and it sprouts right back up. Super neat and tidy and great fall colors. So that's an awesome substitute. And it's tougher than the forsythia will be, frankly. So we've not only have we picked out a native, but we've also made an improvement on the existing plant palette. This is like where I get really excited about it. So we've got that. What else could we use for that kind of site location?
Okay.
What about a fragrant sumac?
Yeah, fragrant sumac. So there's the cultivar Grollo, but like just regular straight species Rus aromatica could also do really well. The only thing with that is that it can't really take shade. So make sure that you're not putting any larger plants in this location that are going to shade it too much. Crab apples would probably be fine, but you can't really do like a larger stature like elm or maple or something like that. But yeah, fragrant sumac, tough as nails, takes salt like it's nobody's business, not going to get browsed by rabbits, and pretty easy to shear and maintain too. As long as you like have a full bed for it to fill out in, they look gorgeous. So great. Any other ideas on that one for like a spreading low, like native?
What about a red twig dogwood?
Red twig dogwood could work too. That one might be a little bit taller. So if you're looking to have like a screening buffer, that could absolutely work. But like if we're trying to have it be more of just like a physical barrier, like, or physical in the sense of like, we're really suggesting you don't walk through here, but like, you know, can't really stop you. That one gives you more of like that wall effect. It would look gorgeous in winter though, right? So that's a good point with that one. So, but then we've also got like these ornamental shrubs near the building. So that would be a great spot for that dwarf or for red osier dogwood. You know, these locations right here off this side in front of these windows, because those are going to be flowering in mid-season. That red on green is really attractive. What other like larger native shrubs could we use as more foundation plantings? You know, because we want to use bigger plants in these areas because we have a big building to contend with. So you don't really get to do that super small up close gardening. You want something that gives you a little bit more immediate impact.
Some of the viburnums look really good, like the prunifolium, and I don't know them all by species name, but a lot of viburnums fit into that category.
Yeah, we could definitely do like black haw viburnum. We could do, I wouldn't do nannyberry or like raffinesque viburnum because those are like more colony forming plants that get big. But you could definitely do witherrod viburnum with that beautiful glossy leaf and that wonderful intense fall color. Yeah, so those like 5 to 6 foot viburnums would work really well. What else would work in that space?
I really like black chokeberry. I
Mhm.
have those actually behind my deck in my house, and they're just really great shrubs. They look good in the fall. They have berries, and they're just really like easy. So
Yeah,
I'd
those are
recommend
an
them.
awesome plant. So I liken them to a miniature service berry because they usually tend to like have their bottom like 2 feet free and clear, and then they have the foliage up top. So whenever I had people come in retail that were asking like, "Oh, I want a service berry in my yard," but it's like you don't have room for a full size service berry, I would say, "Well, get a glossy black chokeberry." That's actually what I planted for my parents a couple of years back on their like lot line as like a screening plant because it would show off the bark against the fence, and then the top part would grow above it and be nice and full and block the view. Plus, the fruit would be on it too. So that's another great one. Nine bark, I think, would be an awesome plant. That bark is super cool in the winter on those locations. Um, what else would be a good native shrub for that spot? You could do St. John's wort, Hypericum calmianum, because that one's got a nice rounded habit on its own. Like you can shear it if you want to, but you don't have to. Um, Common snowberry, if it's really dry, like that one's kind of more of a foundational plant, kind of like I imagine it like a boxwood where it's not like super showy on its own, but it's a nice like texture plant, nice backdrop to put other more showy plants in front of. So, there's a lot of good natives that we can use in these locations that tolerate these site conditions that will replace what what we typically gravitate to as our ornamentals, because again, if you drive through a lot of these corporate parks, you're going to see the same plants over and over again because people have gotten lazy and have looked at these plants that do well, and I'm just going to keep planting them. So you're going to see daylilies, catmint, featherweed grass as your perennials. You're going to see Korean lilac, more. You're going to see more like Meyer lilacs than you will see like Miss Kim lilacs because those ones are fine textured. They shear really nicely. You're going to see burning bush because they give you red fall color. You're going to see, maybe an amelancher if you're lucky, but it's a pretty narrow palette that goes into all of these like, office park settings, especially for the ones that were made in like the 90s through the 2000s because there was like no creativity in plant selection back then. Apparently, I don't know.
Eric,
Yeah.
with burning bush now being labeled invasive and on a DNR 40 or whatever, is there work going to developing a sterile variety of that?
I think that there is. I don't know if there's been any success on it yet. The same thing is happening with like the ornamental pears. So
Calories.
the calorie pears,
terrible.
Pyrus caloriana. There's a cultivar, I think it's from J. Frank Schmidt out on the West Coast called Chastity. And that one's a triploid, so it's sterile. It won't like pollinate or cross pollinate. But the problem with that plant is that it's a zone 5, so it's like marginal around here, which I think is great because I hate pear trees. I can't stand them. I think their flowers stink. I think that their branching structure sucks. I think that they have really weak wood. And I think that if you want to have those 3 characteristics, you might as well plant a hawthorn because, hey, at least that one's native. Like you want all the worst like characteristics out of a plant. Like go with something else that fills all, like there's native plants that check all those boxes and are also native. Like there's not really a benefit to going with the ornamental pear. So, but yeah, if we go to this location again, but then we look at what's not appropriate, like what are we going to knock out in these spots? What isn't going to be compatible with this location?
Yeah, we're probably, if it's dry, we're definitely not going to do dogwood or elder or are we looking at shrubs?
Well, we're shrubs, trees, evergreens, whatever. I mean, these all are going into that location. There's no point in just talking only about trees, when we plant all native trees, but then everything else is a Meyer lilac. Like we want to look at it as a whole spectrum here. But like the American elderberry, I've seen them growing in like drier sites, like on the slopes of like railroad embankments. So clearly that's really dry soil. They can grow in those locations, but they might not do as nicely. So that would be one where I'd say is kind of iffy. But yeah, pagoda dogwood, definitely a no-go on this site, unless you could put it on like the way north side of the building where it never gets direct sunlight and it's where all the downspout water goes to. What else would be a good one to avoid in this site? I'm having to figure these out here too, because I didn't want to make like a full list and just say like, oh, here's the 3 plants to avoid and then just move on to the next thing, because that's, that's just me telling you what shouldn't work rather than actually thinking about what isn't going to work.
I think anything messy would not be good, since there's pedestrian traffic and you want to keep it a clean, somewhat formal look.
Yeah, so if we're going in an area that's like close to like a walkway, we want to be avoiding those plants with really heavy fruit production on them. We want to avoid things that are going to attract a lot of birds that are in turn going to like congregate close to where people are sitting, because there's nothing better than going out on your lunch break to sit on the park bench that's now covered in like bird poop, right? So
Right.
we might not want to plant a native like red mulberry.
I was just gonna say, you don't want mulberry. They're really messy to be around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a great plant, just not in this location. So, what else would be a bad one? I'm trying to think here.
Yeah, well, like meadowsweet needs more moisture, right? That's not going to be good.
Right. And that one, like, it's a pretty plant, but it's a prairie plant, right? So any like of these like prairie native shrubs tend to like be really leggy, because like the top is what's trying to get all the sunlight, and they're not going to be pretty down low. So if you're going to use meadowsweet or steeplebush, either of the native spireas, you got to have other stuff around them, and it also has to be the right site for it. So yeah, that would totally be a great example of an inappropriate plant. Regular Kentucky coffee tree that you don't know if it's a male or a female. If it ends up being a female tree, those are huge pods, which, numbers wise, there's not a lot of them, but they are big. So they can be kind of a pain to deal with. And if you're dropping huge pods into this turf here, they're all going to be getting mowed in by the riding mowers. So you're going to end up with bare spots in the turf. So easy fix to that is just not have turf, but that's having pipe dreams at this point. So, but yeah, these are good examples of things that aren't going to work in that space.
Where would witch hazel be useful?
I would say witch hazel would be an excellent plant for this spot, because witch hazel is a nice, like, drier understory tree. It's got a really nice open texture. So I would think that like here on the side of the building, it would do well, but it could also do well in these alcove areas where like light is kind of all over the place and you can't really have a big tree in the first place. I think that witch hazel would be an excellent option there. So that would definitely be one that I wouldn't hesitate to put out there. I think it would be a great plant to do. So, great question. Any others before we jump onto the playground? Because this one I think is going to be really fun. So, all right. So this is the site that we're dealing with here. We've got not really salt to deal with. Might have a little bit. We're going to have a lot of foot traffic, so we're going to have compaction around there. Soils are going to be a mess all over the place. We want stuff that's going to be able to tolerate, kids, and we also want things that are safe. So, like, what's our go-to for like playground plantings like nowadays? What do you think of when you think of a playground tree, or do you even think of one at all? So,
Spireas.
Yep, spireas, because they're easy to do. They've got the long flowering, but they don't really attract a ton of bugs. Totally. Any other ones? I would say that, like, again, lilacs are another common one, because again, it's easy to just put out the same plant over and over and over again. So they flower in spring and then they look nice all year, and then they turn purple in fall, and then you can shear the crap out of them and just move on with your life. The playground that was in my neighborhood growing up had big old honey locust by it, which are great because they're super strong wooded, coarser branching structure, filtered shade. So like the little tiny leaflets that would fall down would fall into the wood chips, and you're not having to like blow them out. So
Right.
any like leaves that are produced, you'd want to have like, kind of a smaller size. What else would be good out there? What else do I think is a go-to for a play structure, play area? Yeah, generally speaking, it's just tougher plants, easy like go-to stuff. Again, like burning bush and so on. Maybe a Freeman maple here and there, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity to be using more plantings in play areas, because I think that to, imply that like the play area has to be totally constructed and like anthropogenic is kind of like, well, what did kids do 2,000 years ago before we had plastic slides? They just never have fun? Well, probably not, because they were all working on farms, but I'm sure that they did something for fun, right? So like you can have plants out there as part of the play area. We just have to take into account those consequences of like vandalism and safety. Because again, you can't start with really tiny, like wimpy stuff. You got to start with something that's a little bit bigger, a little bit coarser, and you got to have plants that can tolerate being ran into or smashed. So, we've got our appropriate things, and then we've also got like what would not be an appropriate plant in this location. So for me, I don't think that like really super thick, dense plants are appropriate, because I think people, and this isn't like me thinking that because I believe it, but I think this is a perception, is that you don't want to have like hiding spaces on playgrounds. Like you want to be able to have pretty good sight lines. So you can have plants that like are out there, but you don't want to have, a grove of like big trees. Case in point, when I was a kid, there was this huge mulberry patch in Wickfield or in Washington Park that I'd go to. And during summer when it was fruiting, I'd just go there and I'd sit out in the woods and eat mulberries until I was sick. And then I'd come home like covered in purple and, like, oh, my stomach hurts. Like, oh, well, you were eating mulberries. No, I wasn't. I swear I wasn't doing it. And then the city came and cut them all down because apparently like a homeless person started living in there, and like, you can't have that in a park at all. So cut them all down. And there they went. So you don't want to have stuff like that where, it could be viewed as like a hiding place, like where bad people could hide out in and do bad people things. So, you could put in a couple of shrubs, but you got to have spacing out there. You don't really want to put in anything that's like hugely colony forming. So again, kind of knocking out the idea of of nannyberry or like any other big colony forming shrub, probably not going to work in that area. But you could definitely throw in like a 9-bark, and then like 15 feet away, throw in another 9-bark, or put in like, some St. John's worts again as like a low row planting, because those only get to be like 3 feet tall. So that's not really, hiding spaces.
That might also be a good place though for witch hazel.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that would be a great one to do, like, especially if you've got other shade trees around there. That would be a great shade tolerant plant. How about elderberry? What do we think on that one?
I like elderberry a lot, but I think because of the berries falling down, kids are going to eat them. And of course, elderberries are okay, but you don't expect an 8-year-old. If you're telling them don't eat stuff in the woods, I don't know. It creates a little bit of a problem. It can be messy. I think they lose a lot of wood every year. So the maintenance on them is a little higher than maybe some of the viburnums.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point too, because like they produce fruit, which isn't toxic. I don't think that elderberries really drop a lot of bad stuff in them too. So the idea of like tainted soil, I don't think would be too problematic, but maybe it could be. But that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of like, how interactive do we want these spaces to be? Do we want people to be able to eat fruits off of these plants? Like, because that's participating in the environment, right? That's what natives do. And that's how we get people interested in plants. When I was growing up, the only exposure that I had to forestry was the chainsaw in a glass box at the Milwaukee Public Museum saying deforestation is bad and the rainforest is dying because of loggers. And then I went to college for forestry, and then I found out, oh wait, yeah, everyone that does in the Amazon sucks, but also like there's good forestry, sustainable forestry that's done up here where, you can direct the natural environment towards a certain way. So we want to make sure that we're not instilling this idea of like fear of plants into people at a young age. We don't want to inoculate a whole generation of people to like, oh, I can't ever eat anything from nature. Where do strawberries come from? The grocery store, like you want people to be able to engage with them out there. I don't think we'd want like prickly ash out there, and also we wouldn't want to plant barberry in a playground either, because that's just a jerk move, because it's thorny and like kids are going to be running around. So why would you put a thorny plant where kids are playing? I don't think you'd want to put any plants that are poisonous, obviously. So we wouldn't want to put like scarlet elderberry out there, because that one is toxic. We wouldn't want to put like, it's not native, but we definitely wouldn't want to plant like monkshood, because that plant is all toxic all over the place. So, there's definite things that we can avoid, but like even when things seem obvious, it's still good to call out like, you know, this is a bad choice for this site because of this, because that can help us further define what it is that we want to have in plants and have the discussions that matter about what we're picking in these locations. So, and then lastly, we've got the urban lot, which I think this one you have the most freedom with in terms of like the goals for the space can kind of be all over the place. You could have people saying, I want this to be open, or I want this to be private. I want to have like rooms out here that I can like sit in and enjoy, or I want areas where I can be doing gardening. I want to be able to grow my own food out here. So I think that the spread of goals that people have in the urban lots is the greatest. So I think that's where the greatest opportunity for creativity exists. So really there's a lot of good options, but still we do have those site conflicts of utilities and so forth. So you don't want to plant a Norway, or you don't want to plant a white spruce underneath the power lines. That's not going to work. You could go with a more compact cultivar, but you're not going to put the straight species out there. And you also don't want to have a tree that eats up the entirety of the yard. You don't want to put a tree right next to the driveway that, you know, is going to grow over it, and suddenly you can't get anything taller than like, you know, an SUV into the driveway. You know, you want to be able to have room to get something larger if that's something that you want to do. This is coming from someone who has like a 40-inch diameter white ash in their backyard growing up that was crammed between the fence and the side, or the fence and the driveway, and had pushed the thing up all over the place. So, you know, driving on it felt like you're driving off road. But you know, you could see that tree from the freeway from a mile away. Like I wouldn't trade that for the world. So again, it's all these ideas of like your goals can change with time, and like what you think is a priority now might not actually be a priority. So really sussing out what people want in these locations is important for these urban lots. I had so many discussions with people in retail of like, you know, I want a crabapple. Okay, well, what do we want to have in this space? Like, you want to, yeah, I want ornamental. I don't want any mess that I have to deal with. Oh, okay, so crabapple isn't going to work right now. Like when you start talking to people what their goals are, but that's not that the goals are static. We don't have to just look at this and say, you know, oh, these are the constraints within which we're going to operate, because we can talk about them. We can talk about how people have to make sacrifices and trade-offs. Like if you want flowering, these are your options. Generally speaking, flowering plants are going to produce fruit, but we can pick a plant that has smaller fruit. Or maybe we can put the plant in a location where when the fruit falls from the tree, it all lands in the mulch bed and it's not a problem. You know, just because there's crab apples out there doesn't mean that the crab apples are going to make a mess. It's just that they're a mess if the tree drops them all on the sidewalk. So having these discussions with people in their urban landscapes is super important, because really you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page with what they're looking for in a space. And then you really start to play with the idea of like eliminating different plants, different families, different sizes from your overall plant list. So again, going back to that idea of like selection through elimination, rather than just Kentucky coffee tree is a great tree, we should plant it everywhere, and oh my God, there's a new invasive pest and now they're all dying. Like we don't want to have a repeat of that again. So as far as things to remember when it comes to like site selection, site assessment, a big one I would say is that plants aren't and don't have to be symmetrical. This is a huge old crabapple outside of Marquette in downtown Milwaukee. It is much wider than it is deep. So while we might say that a crabapple gets to be 35 feet tall and wide, that's not a 35-foot tall and wide cylinder. That's what it could be if it was grown in perfect conditions out in the open, got even sunlight all directions. But clearly it doesn't have to stay that way. Now, I wouldn't say that you should plant a 30-foot tall and wide crabapple and try to keep it 8 feet tall and wide, but it doesn't have to be at least 20 feet away from the building for it to do well, you know, because you can prune it, you can shape it with time, and it can grow in different ways. Another thing is that sites change. And while you might make a great decision one year, in 10 years, that might be totally different. So this is State Street in Wauwatosa near the village. And what do we see different here? They widen the roadway. There's a new like apartment building over here. So there's clearly a lot of construction over there. They put in a fence near the railroad over on this side. So, that tree is totally gone. You might have picked out that tree for that site and said, this is the best tree ever. And everyone was like, yeah, this is a great tree. But, then they had to widen the roadway and now it's no longer compatible with that site. That's not your fault. That's nobody's fault. That's just things changed. So this is a really cool link, by the way, here that lets you do like a slide for aerial photographs of cities through time. It takes them from the 60s or 40s to today. And you can slide the cursor over it to see what the development has been. I'll copy that one and throw it in the chat when we're done with this. And then lastly, it's kind of tangentially related, but please use common sense or critical thinking when it comes to statistics. And this is something that came up not this past year, but the year before that at a conference. There was a talk about how to improve our investment in urban forests and how we have to really invest heavily and put more money into our urban trees because they're such high value. We don't want to just be throwing money away. And they threw out the statistic of, the average lifespan of an urban tree is 7 to 10 years. And I hear that, I'm like, yeah, I've heard that before. 3, 5, 7, 10 years, whatever. Trees die a lot in urban areas. There's a lot of mortality. But then, they start going into, so let's take a conservative estimate even and say that every 10 years you're replanting this tree. And so you spend $400 and then you add this much value for 10 years of it growing and then it dies and you have to put a new one out here. And in 50 years, you've only got a net $3,000 benefit from this tree. But if you use our system, which is basically a knockoff of Silva-cells, where you have a rooting area underneath your pavement, suddenly you plant that tree and it actually lives for 50 years. And now you've got a $15,000 benefit of this plant. Isn't that wonderful? And it totally ignored the idea of what averaging is in terms of statistics. I mean, if the average lifespan of an urban tree is 7 to 10 years old, that doesn't mean that 90% of trees die between 7 and 10 years old. It's because infant mortality is way high. It's the same reason why people are like, oh yeah, the average lifespan in the Middle Ages was 20. It's not because people turned 19 and they were like, oh, I'm dying. It's because infant mortality was ridiculously high. So when you're reading about statistics and trying to convince people about why to plant natives, make sure you're doing it ethically and make sure you keep your head on on a swivel when it comes to hearing statistics that sound really good, because there's a lot of people that have sales pitches that masquerade as informational stuff. And I think that that's wrong and awful. And I think that, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. But frankly, the best thing to do for you is to just keep your eyes out on those numbers from the get-go. So I don't want to call anyone out in particular for this, but it's just, I was really frustrated when I saw that. So I try to make a point of, reminding people of just because someone has a fancy number that goes with it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. We have to consider what the actual data is behind that. Oh, and then also Zelkova doesn't grow here. It's not going to grow here. It's not going to happen. Stop trying to make it a thing. That is for sure a zone 6 plant. I've seen some people say it's zone 5. It dies all the time up here. So, and frankly, it's supposed to be a replacement for elm trees. Well, guess what? We've already got some great American elm cultivars that are resistant to Dutch elm disease. So really, you're not even adding any benefit by bringing this tree up here. So anyways, that's my TED talk. So stop for questions.
Well, I just want to comment right now that I think I need to add witch hazel to our plant sale list this year. I just remembered I really wanted to offer that, and I see that's available through Johnson. So I think I might do a quick ad in of witch hazel, because honestly, I think we've been wanting that one for a long time, and it was always
let me
out, so.
double check here really quick and see I think we're supposed to have really good numbers on that one. Just a heads up to everybody with the Wild One sale. I just put the plants on there that we had and what the prices for the sale would be, but I didn't put inventory numbers. So the sooner that you put in the order, the better. But even if we're out of it, I can still help figure out a good substitute. So for witch hazel, we've got.
It would be the number 2.
Yeah, the number 2s we've got. How many of these are committed? I have 213 of them available. So we have good numbers on them in a number 2 container. So.
Would you be able to send me that spreadsheet that you sent me with the updated availability, so that maybe if I offered something up on the sale that is limited, that maybe I should take it off, I guess?
No, I think it's fine to throw like more limited stuff on there. I can go back through and audit it and just put in like, less than 25, less than 10 available. So if people want to get it, they can jump on that sooner. But if it's like, more than 50, I'm not worried about it. Of course I say that, but then someone's going to call on Monday and say, I want to buy all 213 of your witch hazels because I saw you had them.
Because Joanne wants them.
But yeah.
So yeah, great. And thank you again for providing that to me. It was, that was like the one last thing we were waiting to get in. So we got it done.
Awesome.
This will be a different experience because we've never done just a virtual only sale. So I'm hoping that with everyone's help spreading the word that it'll be successful and that Johnson's will get some business from us.
Yeah, I think it's going to be good. People seem to be a lot more interested in planting this past year, so I'd imagine it gets better this year too. And yeah, as long as the orders come in like sooner than later, I can start getting things reserved too. So if you're taking like rolling orders, you can just send those to me and I can keep adding them to the overall list if we want to just reserve stuff as time goes on. So
okay, yeah, that's good to know. That I will just we'll just keep compiling the orders, and maybe I'll just forward the latest to you, the updates. So our timeline is that we probably will roll out the form this weekend, and then we ask everybody to share, and then we want everything in by the end of March, and then hopefully we will have the list together, and we can reserve it with you. So it'll probably be around the beginning of April that we'll have that done. So that's a good time, right?
Yeah, that'll be fine. So like if the orders come in by the end of March, I can get everything reserved and we can just sit on them until you're ready to take them. So.
All right, great, awesome, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question or two, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
It involves planting of trees and shrubs. Do you take into consideration, example, I love tamaracks, but I don't have what I would consider a tamarack area here in the middle of the city. I threw a few of them out there. They're doing wonderfully. Do I have to concern myself with what grows in the area for the ecosystem, or can I just willy-nilly say if it'll grow, it'll go, and the bigger variety, the better?
Yeah, I think that that's a great viewpoint to take on it, because that's, like, as long as you're aware of some of these plants might not make it, and that's, that is the way it is, and plants die. And like, I have that mindset because I've killed enough plants that, I don't really feel bad about it anymore. But, a lot of people who are like first time plant buyers don't take it so well when their plant fails. So that was always a fine line I had to tread as a salesperson in retail, was just like, my plant died, it's the end of the world. It's like, well, no, we just found out that plant doesn't work well. And sometimes the plant doesn't work well because it's not conducive to the site. And sometimes they don't work well because they're like, that plant in particular just didn't seem to do well in that location. But I'm trying to find a photo here of, it's on this street right here. So tamaracks like to have wet soil, or at least like consistent moisture. They don't need to have it like soaking wet all the time, but they don't like it to ever be dry and droughty. With that in mind, like, we would want to have a space where they, grow well and don't really aren't really prone to drought. But yet I'm going to share my screen here. And this is like a big tamarack in my neighborhood when I was growing up, like right here. So this is a tamarack. It's in this like planting box here, where you would think that like the water isn't really all that available, and yet it looks gorgeous, So I have been proven wrong by plants before. In general, I try to avoid putting them in like drier spaces. And, if someone asked me if that was a good spot for a tamarack, I'd probably say, I don't think so. But clearly this one is loving that spot. So don't be afraid to experiment. If it's working for you, then I would continue doing more. You might have like a water flow underground in that location where, those trees actually get a lot more moisture than you think. And so that's why they're thriving in that location. So, and then when it comes to plant selection, I would always like inform your plant decisions off of what else is growing in that spot. So maidenhair fern, for example, is a really sensitive fern that needs like rich soils out there in order to do well. But if you already have it growing out in your space, then add more. On the opposite hand, like if I'm looking at a space, I'm trying to figure out what I can grow in a space and I see a bunch of maidenhair fern growing, I'm just like, oh, great, I can plant whatever I want. Doesn't matter because I got great soil that I'm working with. So using plants to kind of clue you into what will work in those spaces is a really valuable tool.
So, and again, as far as Mother Nature is concerned, you know, if I put certain native trees that really didn't grow in this region, am I helping or hindering the wildlife? Am I creating an island oasis or creating a plant rich but insect devoid area? Or is there enough diversity in a 10 square mile area that if it's going to be in the area, it'll come to my place, so I don't have to worry about mix or matching? You know, I got oak trees and hawthorns and service berries, and I've got an acre and a half that was farm field that the owner previous to me just let it go. And now there's back there, I cut mowing path so I can walk around back there, but I've got about an 8 foot, 9 foot, whatever these shrubby, brushy, tree, branchy things are, and then quite a variety of trees. And I just been culling invasives out of there. So now it's kind of like I've got a hodgepodge mixture of things back there. I kind of like the idea of, you know, the more variety, the better, but, you know, should I really focus on, you know, area beneficial things for what's in my area? Or can we just generally blanket say all native plants are beneficial, put whatever you want back there?
I think that in like the homeowner perspective of, you know, limited area, I would definitely take the natives are good, plant what grows well, and let the wildlife come in. I think that like trying to manage habitat for a particular species like is good, but I think it also leaves a lot of other like species in the dust. You know, like everyone's all about saving the monarchs, but you know that kind of comes at the expense of people learning more about other butterflies and moths that rely on pollination and like lower use of insecticides. Everyone wants to save the honeybees, but there's also a ton of like native, like really unique species of bumblebees and ground bees out there that are also being harmed by neonicotinoids. So like it's good to have habitat that benefits a particular species, but yeah, I think you're on the right track with having more diversity. And if your site isn't going to accommodate it, then, you know, don't do what I did with my astilbes and bang my head against the wall 3 years in a row. Just plant it. I think I try to give plants 3 chances. Like first time it's like, maybe I didn't know what I was doing planting it. Second time was, oh, maybe that was a bad plant. Third time is like, okay, that thing is definitely not growing here. I'm not going to do it anymore. So I think that habitat level management for a particular group of organisms works well if you're working on like a 40, 160, 640 acre like scale where you can actually like do landscape level management. But I think that if you were to try and like direct your small little slice of heaven out there into like one to benefit one particular species, I think it would be really kind of boring actually, because you're only focusing in on like one beneficiary of these plants when in reality diversity is resiliency, right? So you want, like I say, go for it, mix it up. And you know, I don't imagine that planting a plant a little bit outside of its range is going to be a bad thing, but just that knowing that like that plant might be a little bit more susceptible to like damage from like bad winters and so on. So yeah, go for planting whatever the heck you want to plant out there. I mean, it's your area. Bring in as much stuff as you can. Bring in as much variety as you can.
And why didn't you like the American mountain ash? The berries on there in the few trees I've seen in the street areas in the fall, you've got waxwings just covering those trees. And I thought, wow, that'd be kind of cool. What is it about the American mountain ash that you're saying, oh, I wouldn't plant that?
I thought that you were saying the European mountain ash.
No.
So that's one that was bad. But American mountain ash it's a good plant. It's in the Rosaceae family, so it can get fire blight if it's in like a stressed out position. So I would just make sure that you're putting it in the right site with like, you know, good moisture availability. And like, you know, like I think one of the best examples I ever saw of an American mountain ash was in I want to say it was at Tree Haven, which is Stevens Point's environmental station up in Tomahawk. And it was like growing like right over a creek out there. So like picking it with the right site is good. I wouldn't do a ton of them though, just because I have seen like patches of them just wiped out from fire blight. So
Mhm.
like it would be a good plant to do one of, but I wouldn't do it like en masse and
Right.
like, basically do another monoculture. Like if it's gonna, and I would do like a 1 or 2, because that way then like if it's gonna seed out and reproduce, then great, you've added more like to your seed bank out there. But I wouldn't try to like do all one plant.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, it's after 2 now. I think, we have this reserved till 2:30, no problem, but I want Erik to be able to enjoy his day.
That's okay, I'm having fun.
I really, really enjoyed your talk, Erik, and I feel like we have a lot of similar feelings about things. All your comments, I'm like thinking, yep, I think that too. And I guess it's just a message to me that we need to just speak out more and educate people on this. I mean, I know I had an aunt and uncle that kept planting like the same thing over and over again and it would die. And like, obvious, you need to like reassess your site, right? So I really appreciate all the lessons that you've given us today, things to think about. And I guess if no one else has any other questions, we can end this official first virtual meeting that we survived. I'm like so excited.
Thank you so much, Erik. It was really good.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a blast. So
Great.
All right, well, stay tuned. We'll get that plant sale stuff out soon. I got to add that witch hazel. I forgot. I really did want to do that. So thanks for bringing it up. I seriously hope to see you guys sometime this year in real space instead of virtual. But I'm just glad that you're all still with us and staying healthy. So hang in there.
You too, Joanne. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
have a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.